Right, let's just dive straight into this explainer because honestly, the mainstream narrative blaming our current economic squeeze on a 5-month-old conflict in the Middle East, it's completely falling apart. It's a really simple story to accept, right? A clean, easy cause and effect you could just map out on a napkin. But the second you dig into the actual data, the foundation of that story just instantly crumbles. We've all been sold this idea that recent headlines are what's driving up your grocery bill, but the actual mechanics of what is happening are far, far more deeply rooted.
Right out of the gate, we've got to challenge this easy narrative because when you look at the Federal Reserve's own personal consumption expenditure scoreboard, the PCE, the timeline just doesn't add up. Think about it. The conflict in the Middle East started what, just 5 months ago? But this inflation scoreboard tells a completely different tale. So we're basically using a 5-month-old news story to diagnose a 5-year-old structural problem. And since pretty much every mortgage, car loan, and savings account in the US is priced off this single inflation expectation, we really, really need to understand what's actually moving the needle here. Section 1, the real inflation story. Working backwards to the truth. To understand what is actually draining your wallet, you just have to look at this number, 63. The Fed has missed its inflation target for 63 months in a row. That is literally more than 5 years straight. The PCE right now is sitting at over double what it should be, and it's just continuing to climb. You know, for decades, inflation moved kind of like a pendulum, always naturally swinging back to rest near a target number. People even called it the Great Moderation from 1985 to 2007. But here's the thing, there was no invisible hand at work there. It was the Fed pushing that pendulum. And right now, the entity doing the pushing is in deep, deep trouble. Section 2, the 2% target explained. The Goldilocks number. Now, since every single financial decision in the country is anchored to this 2% target, we really have to ask, where did it even come from? It didn't fall out of some impossibly complex math equation, and it certainly wasn't carved into stone tablets. Somebody just chose it. As St. Louis Fed economist Christopher Neely points out, this target isn't magic. When central banks were figuring all this out, they had to balance the costs of inflation against the benefits of allowing prices to rise just a little bit. It was chosen as a really careful trade-off to stabilize the macroeconomy without completely crushing the everyday American consumer. It's a happy medium. But what does that actually mean in practice? Like, why not just aim for zero? Let's look at this comparison, because the crucial point here is that 0% inflation actually leaves the Fed structurally trapped during a recession. When the economy tanks, the Fed's main weapon is cutting interest rates. But if inflation is zero, rates are already sitting near the floor. They get maybe one cut before they completely run out of road, risking a decade-long depression. On the flip side, 4% inflation, that makes prices double every 18 years. Businesses literally can't forecast, and you can't price a long-term contract. So 2% is that sweet spot, high enough to give the Fed a cushion to cut rates during a crisis, but low enough that you barely even notice it day to day. Actually hitting it, though, well, that takes a nearly impossible balancing act. Section 3, the Volcker Shock Playbook, when the pendulum swung too far. For decades, the Fed kept this balance pretty perfectly. But to understand how they used to fight inflation, we need to rewind a bit to the late 1970s. Inflation wasn't just drifting up back then, it was sprinting, peaking at over 13.5%. The dollar in your pocket was literally rotting while you held it. Then, in 1979, Paul Volcker takes over as Fed chair and does what absolutely nobody else had the stomach for. He aggressively drove interest rates to a staggering 20%. This was a deliberate move, and it triggered back-to-back recessions. It was brutal, but it worked. He successfully strangled the money supply until inflation had nothing left to feed on, dropping it back under 2% and ushering in that great moderation we just talked about. This whole playbook became known as the Volcker Shock. Section 4, the National Debt Trap. Why we can't repeat the 1980s. Which raises the obvious question, right? If it worked so well for Volcker, why can't Jerome Powell just run the exact same aggressive playbook today? Why not just crank rates and crush inflation once and for all? Well, because Volcker had one massive advantage. The country could actually absorb the damage. Back in 1980, the national debt was roughly 25% of GDP. His rate hikes acted as a clean break on the economy. Today, our national debt sits at roughly 100% of GDP, a one-to-one match with the entire economy. We literally haven't seen this since World War II. And this massive debt, it fundamentally breaks the old playbook. Today, that debt is closing in on an astronomical $40 trillion. And as a result, a staggering 19 cents of every single federal tax dollar collected is immediately swallowed up just paying interest to bondholders. Think about that. That is over $1 trillion a year, which is more than the entire U.S. military budget. And right here, This is exactly where the trap snaps shut. Because of this massive pile of debt, every single time the Fed raises rates to cool down the economy, they accidentally increase those trillion-dollar interest payouts. Higher rates simply mean the government pays more interest to the banks, the pension funds, and the investors holding its bonds. And what happens to that money? It gets spent and loaned right back out. It literally means both pedals are floored and the brake is wired directly to the accelerator. Squeezing the economy with higher rates silently pumps massive amounts of money right back into the system through these interest payouts. Actually, two economists, Thomas Sargent and Neil Wallace, predicted this exact trap 45 years ago. They warned that if the government doesn't stop overspending and running deficits, the central bank can't magically make the debt smaller. All the Fed gets to decide is what form the debt takes, bonds or cash. Fighting inflation today by squeezing cash just forces the bond side to grow. And since bonds pay interest, the pile of debt just compounds faster and faster. In short, fighting inflation today just forces the Fed to print more cash later to cover the debt. They aren't curing inflation at all, they are just postponing it.
Section 5. Printing money. QE and QT. The hidden levers.
Now, money doesn't just appear out of nowhere. If inflation is a problem of too much money chasing too few goods, someone is actively pumping that money in. Enter the Fed's hidden lever, quantitative easing, or QE. Back during the 2020 pandemic, the economy was completely stalling out, so the Fed utilized QE to basically create money out of thin air to buy bonds, artificially expanding their balance sheet from $4 trillion to nearly $9 trillion in just 2 years. They flooded the financial system with fresh cash just to keep it alive. But as you can probably guess, that massive injection of cash is exactly what eventually ignited our current inflation fire, pushing it over 9% in mid-2022. To put out that fire, the Fed had to do something they have almost never done. They utilized quantitative tightening, or QT. This is essentially running the money printer in reverse. By letting existing bonds expire without replacing them, they successfully drained about $2.2 trillion out of the system. This actually shrank the M2 money supply for the first time since the Great Depression. But as you can see in these steps, here is the catch. You can't tighten forever without literally breaking the financial system. The U.S. economy needs a certain baseline amount of cash just sitting in it to function day to day. Once they drained the balance sheet and hit that absolute minimum cash limit, things really risked breaking. Which is exactly why, on December 12th of last year, the Fed quietly restarted the money printer, committing to buying back bonds at around $40 billion a month. The balance sheet is refilling all over again. Section 6. The Deficit Dilemma, a Century of Structural Spending. Honestly, all of this complex monetary juggling, the rates, the QE, the QT, it's really just a Band-Aid covering up a massive structural problem running underneath the surface of our entire economy. We are trapped in a terrifying, repeating cycle. Take a look at these numbers. This fiscal year's deficit is estimated at $1.4 trillion, which is a massive 5.8% of the entire economy, way above historical averages. With total national debt closing in on $40 trillion, our net interest payments now exceed $1 trillion annually. Think about that. Interest is now the third largest item in the federal budget. We've been structurally spending more than we bring in for a quarter of a century straight. And the math here is brutal. The more we borrow, the more interest we owe, and the more interest we owe, the more we have to borrow. So how on earth do you fix it? Well, Warren Buffett famously joked with this pretty brilliant quote. He said, anytime there's a deficit of more than 3% of GDP, all sitting members of Congress are ineligible for re-election. Underneath the humor, though, he's absolutely hitting the nail on the head about the root cause. It's an incentives problem. And to be clear, it's an American problem, not a left or right problem. Politicians build careers on promising people more, not less. And until those bipartisan incentives change, the structural spending is just going to continue to compound. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to take a hard look at your own wallet and the world around you. We've seen how that 2% target relies on a really delicate balance that our massive national debt has completely disrupted. The old Volcker playbook is broken because high rates now just pump more interest cash straight back into the system. So I have to ask you, is this compounding debt cycle a structural crisis we need to solve right now, or are we crashing out over nothing? Because one thing is absolutely certain for sure, the ground is shifting, and we just can't ignore these fault lines forever. What do you think?